far-reaching impact on American foreign policy from then on. In Korea, General Walton Walker, the stubborn defender of the Busan perimeter, died in a road accident in late December. As his body was returned to the States for burial, his replacement was already en route. General Matthew Ridgway was a paratrooper with a distinguished record in World War II. The grenade and field dressing he wore on his webbing became the personal trademark of this charismatic figure. As he took over the demoralized 8th Army, it was still in retreat. The northern forces swept into Seoul at the end of December, and again the 8th Army couldn't hold them. Those that could withdrew, as first Seoul and then Wonju fell to the north once more. South of Wonju, the 8th Army dug in and finally held the line. Whether through their efforts or because the Chinese supply line had reached its limit, the southward drive stopped. Ridgway now worked a remarkable transformation on his force. Within weeks of his appointment, the attitude among his men had changed. And he changed the tactics too, deciding to maximize the UN's chief advantage, sheer firepower. They called it the meat grinder. Chinese columns were broken up at long range by artillery and air action on an unprecedented scale. And it worked. In January, they began steadily grinding their way north for the second time. Ridgway ordered them always to move in sufficient strength to provide all-round defense, allowing their artillery and air support to beat a path for them. There was to be no repeat of the first headlong dash north, where the narrow road-bound columns had been encircled or infiltrated with ease. Now they moved in strength across country as well, paying renewed attention to key features in the terrain, ready to hold the high ground if counterattacked, and their confidence grew with each victory. At one point, their advance and the spring thaw revealed the fate of some of their comrades. Either ambushed by guerrillas or overtaken by the north in the winter retreat, roped hands and feet revealed they'd been killed after capture. Just one more atrocity in a particularly savage war. By April, they were across the 38th parallel once again. Seoul had changed hands for the 4th time in 1 year. As they consolidated their hold on the south, a political and military debate broke out over the next objective. Faced with the rising cost in UN lives, President Truman decided that widening the war would be unsustainable politically, and he limited the UN to a defense of the South. But MacArthur did not agree. From his headquarters in Japan, he was publicly critical of the concept of a limited war. He'd already submitted a long list of nuclear targets on both sides of the Korean-Chinese border. And in early April, he called for all-out war on China, using the nationalist armies from Formosa. By the 11th of April, Truman had had enough.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
It created a political storm in America. General MacArthur came home to a hero's welcome after 13 years in the Far East. For many Americans, the victor of the Pacific and mastermind of Incheon could do no wrong. There was strong support for the stance which he outlined once more to a joint session of Congress before taking his final emotional farewell.
I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
General Ridgway's transformation of the 8th Army made him the obvious choice to take over MacArthur's role at headquarters in Tokyo. The day his own replacement, General Van Fleet, took command in the field, the full force of a Chinese counterattack fell on the 600 men of the British Gloucester Regiment. They stood their ground on the Imjin River for 4 days, by which time only 50 men had escaped death or capture. They held an entire army long enough for the Allies to reform and repulse the attack. Ridgway's meat grinder advance and the defeat of the Chinese offensives left the front line near the 38th parallel, and both sides agreed to negotiate, following a Russian initiative. On the 10th of July 1951, a UN team flew to the ancient Korean capital of Kaesong to begin negotiations with representatives of both the North Korean and Chinese forces. Both sides now needed and wanted a ceasefire. Hopes of peace were high, and at first it seemed tantalizingly close. But there would be frequent breakdowns. The talking and the fighting dragged on at enormous cost in lives for over 2 more years. At the front it was stalemate. Both sides had dug in, and the only aim was to bludgeon a response from the opposite negotiating team. The Chinese still attacked in human waves, apparently heedless of the losses they suffered from the merciless UN firepower. They fought for each hill, seeking the slightest strategic advantage. Field hospitals and helicopters improved the chances of survival, but the casualty figures grew. Previously unknown and unremarkable hills became infamous over the next 2 years, as battles raged over their pitted slopes. White Horse Hill, Old Baldy, Pork Chop Hill were lost, won back, and then given up as the line on the negotiating table was straightened or otherwise altered. The talks had moved to Panmunjom, where the latest stumbling block was the repatriation of prisoners of war. The UN claimed that many of the Chinese wanted to join the nationalists on Formosa. The Chinese argued that they should all be returned, and a propaganda battle ensued. Within the camps, communist and anti-communist groups organized and intimidated each other. When communist prisoners took control of Koji-do prison camp, tanks and flamethrowers were called in to retake it. The evident force used to suppress the revolt shocked many. Talks faltered again, with the UN slipping behind in the propaganda war. For over a year, sustained air attacks attempted to cut supplies to the Chinese front line. Three-quarters of the Air Force and all the carrier planes were dedicated to Operation Strangle. Yet it still failed to stop all movement of supplies. Northern labour gangs constantly repaired and replaced road and rail links, almost as fast as they were hit. And though they flattened whole cities, the communists simply moved their factories underground, where they continued to turn out the weapons required at the front. Despite statistical claims to the contrary, the air campaign failed to achieve its stated aims in Korea, just as it would again in Vietnam. At the front, the routine continued. Thousands of tons of ordnance delivered a few miles away, with all the calculation and geometrical precision of the production line. The exchange of sick and wounded prisoners in March 1953 was the first movement towards a ceasefire. With the UN as a belligerent, a commission of neutral nations was required to oversee the peace process. Finally, on the 27th of July 1953, General William Harrison led the UN delegation into Panmunjom. Without a word or a sign to each other, he and the North Korean general, Nam Il, signed the armistice agreement. There was no South Korean signature on the document, as Syngman Rhee still refused to accept the existence of the dividing line in Korea, which after 3 years and millions of lives had come to rest almost where it started, near the 38th parallel. Today, the two sides still watch each other warily across the same blood-soaked strip of land that separates the two Koreas.